I'm National Master Jesse Cohen. This is Summit School of Chess. Let's learn how to read the board. Today's lesson, smash the center. I thought that what we might do in order to tackle plans is look at one of the lesson series on chess.com. This comes from Jeremy Silman's lesson series called The Roots of Positional Understanding. It's one of my favorite lesson series on chess.com from one of my favorite authors and players of all time. In it, he presents you with a series of positions that are extremely instructional. Let's just dive right in, yeah? This is kind of a typical opening position. Black has developed a little bit interestingly, fianchettoing the bishop on g7 instead of bringing it out a bit more traditionally the way that white has by moving a center pawn. And, a big part of being able to figure out the plans in a position is being able to see what Jeremy Silman calls imbalances. An imbalance is any major difference between your position and your opponent's. And he also starts to break down what are the biggest categories when it comes to differences. And one of the biggest categories, I think, is kind of space and the center. In this position, out of all the center squares, white is the only player to have any control of it all, any occupancy of it all. Now, I'll go into a different lesson about just how important the center is and why it's so important if you like, but just know that it is very important. And you should know that if your opponent has two pawns in the center, and sometimes even one pawn in the center, if your opponent has the center and you're doing nothing about it, you usually need to fight back. You usually need to smash it. In this position, which is actually pretty stereotypical for a Pyrrhic defense, Black has allowed white on purpose to establish the center with the intention of dismantling it, okay? And for those who play such systems, typically Black is going to be focused on the dark squares. Typically, Black is looking for a move like pawn to e5 or pawn to c5. However, in this exact position, Black actually has a tactical, common, thematic resource at our disposal, and that is known as a center fork trick. So basically, here's what you need to know in terms of a plan. In this position, if you're taking this on, besides thinking to yourself, okay, this is the opening, I still haven't developed my knights or my bishops, I need to do that, you should be thinking especially, I need to pounce on this center immediately, because the longer you let that center just simmer there, the more time it gives white to reinforce it and make it indestructible, which is what Jeremy Silman says is the responsibility of the person who has a center. If you have the center, if you're playing white in this position, what you should be doing is voluntarily reinforcing, using your pieces to defend these two pawns more than you have to. And be aware of how, Black is going to try and strike it and take it down. Before I show you on this what the center fork trick is, I want to show you the most common example of it. One of the most common places where the center fork trick happens actually arises right out of the four knights opening. In this position, white all too often plays the mistake of bishop to c4. After all, this is where the bishop wants to go in a lot of openings. It's fantastic here most of the time. It attacks the center, it has a lot of mobility, it even targets that weakest square f7 only guarded by Black's king. But in this specific situation, Black can do this. Knight takes e4. Center fork trick. This is an intentional sacrifice of the knight for the pawn. Knight takes knight. Do you see the fork now? d5. The queen supports this push, hitting the knight and the bishop. At this point, there's no way that white can save both pieces at the same time because we only get one turn per move. So they can save the knight by playing bishop takes pawn, and then we take back with our queen, and then perhaps they save their knight with pawn to d3. And in this position, we're just better already. That's a big problem for white. And that's because black has already stolen the center from white. Look at black center pawn compared to white center pawn. Also, most masters prefer to have 2 bishops over 2 knights, especially as the position is pretty open. Lots of nice open diagonals here for both bishops. The other option that could have happened would have been saving the bishop with bishop to d3. But then after bishop to d3, pawn takes knight, bishop takes back, and bishop to d6. And in this position, black is also, I would say, equal or even better because black has the pawn in the center, and notice how black's bishop is unblocked, but somehow white's isn't. Somehow black is ahead in development. So again, the center fork trick just does really well. Side note for chess enthusiasts, there is another variation that sometimes people try once they realize the center fork trick is going to happen, or they've seen it in a book somewhere and they think it's going to be okay. They sacrifice this bishop on f7, and that's because they know that they're going to lose a piece anyway. So they say, well, if I'm going to lose a piece, then let's stop black from castling. But after the king takes the bishop and white takes back, black plays the move pawn to d5. And after knight to g5 check, king to g6, now white is immediately in trouble. The only thing that is saving that knight from the black queen is the white knight. And black would love to just attack that white knight with the pawn. So pawn d4 is usually the move played here. This is going to guard the bishop with here. That way if pawn e4, maybe knight e5 is not going to be so bad. But instead, black plays pawn to h6, attacking the bishop. Sorry, pawn h6, attacking the knight. And then after the knight retreats to the only safe square on h3, bishop to g4. And you can look this up for yourself, but this is even what the computer says is a winning position. This knight is way locked out. The threat on d4 is real. Black's king is totally safe. And everything is just totally good for black, actually, when you really take a close look at this. So, back to this position. I know that this is not the same position, but I hope that you see the similarities. The pawn on e4, the knights, and the bishop. Perhaps that's all that this problem actually needs to take place. In this position again, and in all positions, if you want to become a master, you should be able to say, quite quickly, hopefully, what is the most important thing that you should do in this position? Okay? And it really should be smashing the center. Anytime that you see a center with 2 pawns and they're not yours, you should be thinking to smash it, most of the time. And in this position, if you remember that center fork trick, you're going to find knight takes e4. And just to show the rest of that combination, again, after either knight takes knight, pawn d5, forking the bishop and the knight, guarded by the queen. And now either the bishop takes the pawn and the queen takes back. And it's not quite the same position, but again, black has succeeded in destroying half of white center, and in addition, there's an immediate threat on the knight, and we've won the bishop pair, 2 bishops. I love having 2 bishops compared to when my opponent only has 2 knights. And so this is wonderful. The other option is to play bishop to d3. And in that case, we're going to play pawn takes knight and bishop takes back. And that is actually going to lead us into our next problem. Again, what should you be thinking if this is your position? Hopefully you should be thinking, in addition to, hey, the opening is not complete and the knight and the bishop have not come out. You should also be thinking, my opponent has a pawn in the center and I don't. I should smash it. Now, how do you attack it? Should you play a move here, like knight c6? Think about it. The answer is no. Why? You have to think about how the opponent can defend. If we start piling up on this pawn, how can white defend it? What is the least valuable piece that white can use to defend it? This little pawn on c3. So, here's what I'm saying. If we know that the opponent can defend with a 1-point unit, then we have to plan an attack based on us using a 1-point unit or less, unless you're going to sacrifice. Unless you're going to play knight out to c6, they guard that pawn, and then we're just going to take it, okay? Now, the only two ways that we can attack that d4 pawn is with pawn to c5 and pawn to e5. Which pawn should we choose? The real true answer is you should calculate both of them because they both make a lot of sense in their own ways, and you should try to see which future is going to look the best for black. But as a default, you should think this. Pawns are more valuable when they are center pawns, and as they get further and further away from the center, they become less and less valuable. So, should we use a more valuable pawn or a less valuable pawn to do our job? We should use a less valuable pawn, pawn to c5. And I'm going to show you as well that all the calculation backs this up. No matter how white decides to defend the situation or deal with the situation, it doesn't quite work. If white decides that that is just a free pawn, we have many, many ways to deal with this. If you want that pawn back immediately, you can play queen to a5 check, attacking the unprotected pawn and the king at the same time. There is no way that white can get out of check and save that pawn. So we can just take it back next turn. But the real best way is actually queen c7, followed by something like knight d7 and knight takes c5, and we just destroyed white's center. Remember, our goal was to destroy white's center, and does white have a pawn center? No. So we've succeeded. White could try to keep the pawn center by playing pawn c3. But now we're going to play pawn takes back, and they're going to play pawn takes as well. And why are we okay with this? Yes, white might be able to hold their head high and say, I kept the center. It's true, you did. But that, my friends, is what is known as an isolated pawn. It is a pawn that can no longer be defended by any other pawns. That makes it a burden to more valuable pieces. And we'll talk about that in another lesson. And so black will easily in this position be able to pile up on it. Remember, a weakness is only as weak as it can be punished. And in this position, how well can black's pieces arrange themselves to attack d4? This queen can come out to b6. This knight can come over to c6. This rook can come over to d1 to d8. This rook can come over to d8, which also pins it to the queen. And then eventually we can even play e5. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attackers. I think black's going to have a really good time here, okay? The final variation I want to show you, and again, for those who have stuck in here with me, I just want to say great job. I know that this isn't the most exciting part of the video necessarily, but if you want to play like a master, you need to know the different pathways. Like, that's a big part about being a master, is looking and saying, okay, if I choose that move that looks so nice to me, what is my opponent's next move going to be? What would I play if I was them? And that's just a place that you start, and then you kind of build from there. And if you can get good at that, then you start asking, then what would I do after their best move? And you try to look at the different pathways that could happen and try to see the ones that are going to go for your benefit, right? The last pathway that's worthwhile, that makes sense, is white trying to keep the avoidance of trading, is for white to avoid trading the center pawn for the non-center pawn by playing pawn to d5. But in this position, it just so happens, based on checks, captures, and threats, that we have a tactic. The actual ugly move, positionally ugly, tactically correct, pawn f5, simply threatening the bishop. Take a look. The only safe square for it is bishop d3. And after queen captures on d5, notice how the bishop and the queen were the only things keeping that safe. And when the bishop goes back to d3, it silences the bishop from guarding it, and it also blocks the queen. Queen takes d5. And for those who are really being aware, yes, I see that lineup, but there's no way to punish it. Yes, white could try to be tricky and play pawn b3, trying to support that kind of trick, but we don't have to fall for it, okay? Anyways, let's circle back full round, okay? Let's get full circle. This whole lesson series let's circle back around. This whole lesson series is all about how to make a plan. And how to make a plan, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I'm going to discuss all sorts of different methods. But ultimately, the way that I think making a plan is best is you have to be able to see what are the most important aspects of the position going on, and how should you react based on that information. Okay? If your opponent has the pawn center and you have none of it, you should think to yourself, I need to smash it. And then you should consider, how can they defend it? If they can defend it with pawns, you have to smash it with pawns. If they can't, then you can use your pieces. But you're usually going to use both, okay? So use this strategy yourself. And remember, you can use the adverse of this strategy as well. And we'll talk about that in another lesson. If you are the side that has the pawn center, 1 or 2 in the center, and your opponent doesn't, you should be trying to make sure that your opponent cannot smash your center, that it remains an unbreakable force. And again, we'll talk about that later. I love you guys so much. Again, thank you so much for helping me break the 100 subscriber mark, and I want to keep making amazing videos for you. Until next time, goodbye for now.